organization. And we've got funders in the room, we've got nonprofits in the room. We're really, happy to have a good group of folks here. And we welcome your voice into this conversation. We're going to share some information with you, but really also want to hear from folks around the call as well. So at any time today, please chat in your questions, and we'll also have time at the end for folks to discuss what we're learning from the report and to unmute yourself and bring your voice into the conversation too. So over the past year, nonprofits have experienced obviously disruptions and upheaval from COVID-19 and have had to respond to just unprecedented impacts on their operations, their staff, their clients. And that impact from the pandemic has added to the ongoing struggles that nonprofits have faced to find and keep affordable space in the Bay Area's highly competitive real estate market. So this issue of affordable space for nonprofits, it's something that NCG has been convening partners around through our Nonprofit Displacement Project since 2016. So before we get into the report findings today, I just want to give a little background on what the Nonprofit Displacement Project is, and share that since, as with all things COVID, COVID exacerbated existing problems like the struggles with the real estate market, as well as created new ones. So what gets lifted up in our conversation today, it's not just about addressing those new problems that COVID caused, but also figuring out how can we start to, or just make more headway on the persistent issue of the lack of stable, affordable space for nonprofits, which is really a crucial part of their long-term sustainability. So as we think about how we're going to recover and rebuild better and more equitably, we know that we need strong, thriving nonprofits to do that. So, they do the work in the community that has been helping us manage through COVID and is going to help us get through the recovery as well. So we started the Nonprofit Displacement Project. Actually, I'm going to just share a couple slides. I don't know if they're going to be super helpful for what I'm saying, but you'll have something to look at besides just my face. Sorry. Okay. Is that coming up for folks? Can folks see that, or is it? Because my screen is
not yet. It's still black. Sorry.
Now
I can see it.
So I was at the end of the slideshow. Thank you. So we started the Nonprofit Displacement Project after the last recession, when our members were becoming concerned about their grantees not being able to afford the new lease rates that they were being offered, or not even being offered the option to renew when their leases were coming up, because at that time landlords were trying to clear out space for tech, which is a little ironic now given that tech is kind of going more remote. But at any rate, so at that time, members were wanting to understand better what was going on with nonprofits, what was the picture of what they were facing. So NCG did some initial research, and we did an initial report in 2016 that really looked across the whole Bay Area to better understand what nonprofits were facing. And what came back was not a great picture. Things were really tough at that time, and still are. So the vast majority of nonprofits expressed that they were really concerned that the real estate market was going to have a negative impact on their long-term sustainability. And that was especially true for nonprofits that serve low-income communities and communities of color. And more than 2/3 of the nonprofits that responded thought they were going to have to make a decision about moving within the next 5 years. And for most of them, that was because of the affordability of space. And moving is really, really disruptive for an organization. So it was, there was a lot of concern and a lot of issues to work on. And we did a follow-up report in 2018 as well to look at the status of what was going on in Silicon Valley a little bit more deeply. And what we found in that was, it was really in line with what we found in the initial report, the same levels of concerns and issues that were showing up for nonprofits. And that really showed us that how persistent this issue around the lack of affordable space is for organizations. And then in this report, we also heard about how the lack of affordable housing was having a compounding effect on nonprofits and was an additional threat to their budgets and sustainability. So we used this initial research that we did back in 2016. We started to convene a working group. We used the research to raise the profile of this issue. We used it to bring nonprofits together to really talk about the results and to share what were the solutions that they felt would be most helpful for them to meet these challenges. And then we convened a working group to work on trying to advance some of those solutions that were lifted up by nonprofits. So the Nonprofit Displacement Project working group it's a multi-stakeholder group. There's philanthropy at the table, the public sector, nonprofits, nonprofit networks, financial institutions. And the folks at the table are coming together to support, because they want to support the long-term sustainability and capacity of nonprofits in the Bay Area by creating and preserving affordable space in our crazy real estate markets. And everybody, folks are at the table because they know how important strong nonprofit infrastructure is to, it's essential to thriving communities. Nonprofits, they provide needed services, they're cultural institutions, they're employers, they're part of the fabric of our communities. And so, making sure that they're strong and sustainable and with us over the long term is it's critical. So, and then I also want to note, Community Vision is a key partner for us in this work. They are part of the working group. They're on the leadership and the steering committee for the working group, and they really provide the real estate expertise for us and our critical partners in helping to move some of the solutions forward that are coming out of the working group as well. And so the solution, the working group has supported a number of solutions over the years. They've supported real estate technical assistance for organizations. They supported the launch of Spaces for Good, which is a free online space listing tool for nonprofits to find and list affordable space. They also supported, members have supported All Good Work, which is an organization that connects nonprofits with donated seats and co-working sites. And then members of the working group are also supporting a project that's launching this spring called California Community Owned Real Estate. And this is a statewide 5-year initiative to expand the capacity of small and emergent local community development corporations and community land trusts and other local nonprofit real estate efforts to really drive community land control. And this work is being led by Community Vision in partnership with Genesis LA. So all that to say that prior to COVID, nonprofits were struggling with this tough commercial real estate market that we have here, compounded by the equally tough housing market, which the housing market was making it difficult for nonprofits to attract and retain staff and be able to pay folks the salaries that they needed to live here. So a lot of things that were really impacting nonprofit budgets and presented threats to their long-term sustainability. And then on top of that, COVID hit, and that brought a new set of space and sustainability challenges for nonprofits. So now we're trying to figure out, how do we renegotiate our leases, shed unused space, adapt spaces to meet physical distancing requirements, or for some organizations who are really seeing an expansion in demand, or were looking to expand their space because they had such an increased demand for their services. So it's been a lot on all fronts for nonprofits to deal with. And it's been a really tough year for people on a personal level, particularly for Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and other people of color who've experienced the most severe health and economic impacts of COVID-19. So we've been navigating into this uncertain future for over a year, which is exhausting. And even though the vaccines are bringing light to the end of the tunnel, we're not going to come out of the tunnel to the same world that we left a year ago. The inequities and challenges that we had before COVID have intensified, and there's going to be new challenges facing us, but there are also going to be new opportunities to get behind. So there's a lot to prepare for and figure out as we move towards reopening. So within the Nonprofit Displacement Project working group, as we were discussing, how can we support and equitable recovery from COVID-19 for nonprofits, we realized that we needed to get a better picture of what the real estate challenges were for nonprofits. What are the financial implications of them? What are folks thinking about for how they're going to operate and use space in the future? And we wanted to learn this so that we could figure out, well, how can we play a role to support nonprofits navigating these challenges and opportunities? So to help with this, NCG, in collaboration with Community Vision, engaged Harder+Company to conduct a survey of nonprofits at the end of 2020. And Harder+Company, they're joining us today to share the report findings. So we are going to hear from Haley from Harder in just a second. And then after we hear from Haley, we're going to have time for discussion to hear what types of solutions you think will be helpful to address the issues raised in the report. This slide that I have up here right now, these were solutions that all came from nonprofits after we did the other two reports that we've done, where we asked folks for feedback. And this is really, it acts as a guide for us in the working group to really try to figure out where can we advance solutions. So it's very helpful to have that input and feedback. There's a lot of interesting insights from the report. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and what you are going to, and ideas about how we can make a difference here. And then, and I hope, that we have funders and we have nonprofits on this call. And we hope that, for the funders, we hope that this report will help you better understand the array of space and reopening issues and the opportunities that there are facing Bay Area nonprofits. And we can, we hope also, it'll offer some ideas for how you might engage to support the long-term sustainability of our critical nonprofit community partners. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Haley Mousseau with Harder+Company, who has been our fabulous partner on putting the survey together and doing this report. And she is going to take us through the report. So Haley, I'm going to turn it over.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to bring up my screen. Here we go. Can folks see this okay? Okay. So thank you, Sarah. I'm super happy to be here. So as Sarah said, my name is Haley Mousseau, and I'm a research consultant with Harder+Company Community Research. So Harder+Company helps nonprofit, public sector, and philanthropic clients use data to address major challenges. So in 2016, we worked with Northern California grant makers and the Nonprofit Displacement Partners to conduct the survey of nonprofit displacement that Sarah shared. And we know that there's been some great strides made in the realm of policy and funding since then, but of course now the landscape has shifted and the sector is faced with new challenges. So my team was super excited to work on this new iteration of the survey, exploring how COVID has impacted the sector, what supports nonprofits need right now, and what opportunities the future holds. So before we dive in, I'll just say that we did more analyses than are presented here, including by looking at geography, focus area size, and we often found that there wasn't much variation in how folks were responding. But I will point out a couple of places where there were. And we'll have time for questions at the end. So if there's anything important that you want clarification on, please just make a note of it and we can circle back to it. Okay. So this work was really driven by three research questions. The first, how has the pandemic impacted nonprofits' operations and programming? The second, what impending financial concerns is the sector facing? And finally, what is the future of nonprofit workspace? And so before we dive in, I'll just share a little bit about who responded to the survey. A total of 294 Bay Area nonprofits responded to the survey back in December. And we distributed the survey through a couple of different methods. We had email lists shared by NCG and their partners. We promoted the survey through social media. And we did a snowball method where nonprofits who were completing the survey were asked to share the link with others. And so this group of respondents is reflective of the Bay Area nonprofit and the issues that folks are struggling with. under COVID, but it's not necessarily a statistically representative sample of all the nonprofits in the Bay Area. In terms of location, respondents are mainly located in San Francisco and Alameda counties. So you can see here that 44% of our respondents were headquartered in San Francisco and 28% headquartered in Alameda County. So our respondents varied in terms of size and mission. Most respondents are small or mid-size, meaning that their annual budgets were under 5 million. And respondents worked in a variety of subsectors, the most common of these being arts and culture and direct and human service. And so we use these two factors, size and mission, to understand, dive a little bit deeper into understanding some of the survey results and how different types of nonprofits have been impacted by the pandemic. 39% of the respondents in our sample were led by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And additionally, over 3/4, 78%, serve either exclusively or primarily communities of color who, of course, have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So we also collected information about respondents' occupancy of space. So many of our respondents rent, 68%, and a few have a mix of rentals and owned spaces, and a smaller proportion own their spaces outright. Additionally, most of our respondents are occupying a single workspace. Let's see what's in the chat. Thanks, Sarah. So the first question that was really driving this work was understanding how has the pandemic impacted nonprofits' operations and programming. And the key finding here was that the pandemic has had different impacts for different organizations. And we've thought about this kind of as a V-shaped impact, where organizations have either reduced their services or they've expanded them. So you can see here at the bottom, 48% of respondents have had to stop or reduce their services, and 31% have expanded. And when we look at that by their primary area of work, we see that arts and culture and education and research nonprofits have been the most likely to reduce their programs and services, while nonprofits in other sectors have sustained or even expanded their offerings to meet an increased need. So most respondents, 60%, have maintained their staff size through the pandemic. But the types of nonprofits who've had to reduce services, arts and culture, education and research, have also been the most likely to have to lay off or furlough staff. And I want to sort of pause here and just underline that the impact has been hard, even among those who've been able to maintain their staff size. You'll remember from the previous slide that 31% of our respondents have expanded services. Well, just 18% of them have hired additional staff. And so these two quotes are from survey respondents, and they really kind of illustrate the impact, even among those who've maintained their staff size. So this first person writes, "We've greatly increased our services because of the need. It's been a huge stretch for staff." And another one writes, "We haven't fired or furloughed anyone, but we are taking other austerity measures like slow backfills of positions, which impacts our overall capacity to serve clients." So nearly all of our respondents have taken their programs and services online. 97% have taken at least some of them. And overall, the shift has gone pretty well. So just 13% of respondents said that they were facing challenges with this transition to online. Small organizations, so nonprofits with budgets of under $1 million, were the most likely to have challenges with the transition, whereas large and mid-sized organizations were more likely to have said that the transition has gone smoothly. And so I wanted to end this section on a quote that kind of illustrates the struggle behind these numbers, right? Because on the surface, it seems like folks are, nonprofits are doing fairly well. And so this person writes, we need grantors to understand that although we quickly pivoted almost all our programs online, many of the people we serve do not even have computers, internet, or available minutes on their phones. We need help reaching the vulnerable populations we serve. And we heard this theme from a number of respondents, that they've been able to move online. It's gone okay in terms of working out the tech bugs, but that they haven't been able to engage their constituents in the same ways. So the second question that was really driving this work was understanding what impending financial concerns are nonprofits facing. And we were interested in understanding this intersection between working remotely while still paying rent or mortgage on office or program space. So what this slide shows is the proportion of folks who are fully paying their rent or mortgage broken down by how they're using space. So in the first column here, 15% of our respondents are fully using their space, and nearly all of them, 87%, are fully paying their rent or mortgage. If we shift over to the middle, 47% of our respondents are partially using their space, and most of them are still fully paying their rent or mortgage. Now, if you look at the final column, 38% of our respondents are not using their space at all, but over half, 58%, are still fully paying their rent or mortgage. And so this kind of illustrates the financial burden that respondents are continuing to hold while working remotely. Among our renters, folks who rent, and you'll recall this is about 2/3 of our respondents, just 1/4 of them have been able to negotiate with their landlord. So 51% have had or made no changes to their lease, and about 1/4 fall into some other category where they've ended their lease, or they're trying to end their lease, they're trying to negotiate with their landlord, but have made limited progress. So among all our respondents, 3/4, 75%, are still fully paying their rent or mortgage. But among those who aren't, 41% owe a back amount. So this is a relatively small number of respondents, but collectively they owe a sizable amount. So the median amount owed for those who owe a back amount is $16,000. Nearly all of these organizations are arts and culture or education and research nonprofits headquartered in San Francisco or the East Bay. And if we look at this by who leads the organization, so organizations led by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color aren't more likely to owe a back amount, but they are less likely than white organizations to have that back amount be forgivable. So most respondents who rent their space, 86%, aren't immediately concerned that they'll be evicted once the eviction moratorium is lifted. But eviction aside, some worry about how long they can retain their space. So these two quotes kind of illustrate that. While our organization remains in decent condition, short-term current circumstances are unsustainable. And another person writes, we'll need to consider closing by the end of summer as our funds are running out. So the last question that we're interested in understanding is what is the future of nonprofit workspace? So most of our respondents, 64%, anticipate moving to a hybrid work environment once the pandemic has abated, with some work happening in person and some work happening online. Arts and culture organizations were the most likely to say that they'll return to in-person work, while others, economic, workforce, and community development organizations were most likely to say hybrid work environment is the one that would work best for them. So when we asked whether folks would be interested in sharing space in the future, there was considerable interest. So what this shows is folks who responded yes or I'm not sure to whether they'd be interested in sharing space, broken down by where they're located. And so interest is fairly high overall and highest among respondents who are headquartered in San Francisco, the Peninsula, and the East Bay. And this quote kind of illustrates the possibilities here. So this person writes, "We're able to do more work remotely than we thought. We're very interested in sharing workspace with other small nonprofits. And sharing more than space is possible as well. For example, sharing back office positions such as HR, accounting, grant writer, etc." So we wanted to end on hearing from respondents themselves what sort of supports they need. Nonprofits have been really resilient in maintaining services and supports to communities who've been hardest hit by the pandemic. But we know that city governments across the Bay Area face really tough spending choices in the coming months. And so the nonprofit community needs support to navigate the uncertain future that lies ahead. So we asked what sort of supports, what sort of assistance would you find helpful in supporting your workspace needs? And this was an open-ended questions, and we've sort of pulled out the key themes here. So the most common type of assistance was financial assistance to support ongoing operations, to make up for a loss of earned income, to cover the cost of space improvements. The second most commonly cited type of assistance was assistance with space improvements. And that includes both things like planned renovations and COVID-related ones like HVAC improvements and physical distancing. And then the three other most common types of assistance requested were assistance negotiating lease terms and rates. You'll recall that just 25% of folks have successfully been able to negotiate with their landlord. So they want support doing that. And space facilities and planning, right? The landscape has shifted so dramatically, both on the real estate side and in terms of the possibilities of remote work, that folks want help thinking through their options. And finally, respondents want assistance with reopening strategies. So actually putting those plans into place. And I've included two quotes here that kind of highlight the types of support that respondents are looking for. Ideas and support from philanthropy to help us transition into the new normal would be hugely beneficial. Our ideal situation would be to have a pro bono consultant who could hold our hand or help with some of the legwork, right? Many nonprofits in the Bay Area are small. They don't necessarily have the capacity to go after resources that may already be out there. And they're looking to philanthropy, they're looking to the public sector for support in that regard. So our survey, of course, focused on the impact of the pandemic on nonprofit organizations themselves. But of course, the communities that nonprofits serve have been deeply impacted. And that impact has been disproportionately felt by Black, Latinx, and other communities of color. So this person writes, "The public health and economic crises have had a disproportionate negative impact on organizations rooted in poor and working class communities of color. So it is critical to prioritize these organizations rather than the predominantly white ones that have been prioritized historically. Otherwise, groups rooted in communities of color like ours might not survive." So I wanted to end the presentation on this quote as we jump into sort of reflections and discussion, and as you think about how these findings might shape your work going forward. So I'm going to hand it back to Sarah, who's going to lead us through reflections and discussion.
Thanks, Haley. So that is our report, and I want to open it up now. You can either put questions in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself. I'd love to just hear, do the results in this report, especially for our nonprofit partners that are on the call, or for, I can see that there are a number of folks who run nonprofit centers, so Brower Center, Sarado, Tides on the call as well. If this reflects what you've been hearing from your tenants, or for the funders from your grantees. So would just love to open it up to that, or if there are other specific questions that you have for Haley about the data and any of the points in the report, want to make some space for that. So feel free to chat or unmute yourself. Or I will call on people, since I know some of you.
All right, well, at the risk of being called on, I guess I can chime in for the Brower Center. I don't want to get in trouble. In the findings, actually, I guess I was sort of pleasantly surprised. So for those of you that don't know, the Brower Center is a nonprofit center. We're a LEED Platinum building in downtown Berkeley, and we opened in 2009. We have 3 program areas, but our biggest earned income revenue stream comes from our tenants, our office tenants, which obviously have been shuttered since last March. We also have a conference center program where we typically host over 350 events a year, and that's also an earned income revenue stream that supports the art and education program, which is an art gallery space, which until recently had also been closed. And we almost instantly offered, without really any of our tenants asking, a 10% discount, which doesn't seem like a lot, but we felt like we wanted to recognize that our office tenants aren't able to use their space. So that was for both for-profits and like-minded. We have like-minded for-profits and nonprofit organizations. We decided, instead of trying to really get into an organization's financials, we aren't really set up to analyze who deserves what, and we thought offering it unilaterally across the board, because everyone was feeling it and obviously not able to use their space. The one exception to that was our restaurant, Gather Restaurant, which has obviously been impacted more than office spaces. They weren't really able to use their or work remotely, so we did offer them some significant 25% and 50% discounts in the past months. Overall, thus far, we've offered $150,000 in rent relief, which luckily we were able to get first round and second round PPP funding to help support that. Otherwise, we would certainly be operating in the red, and we do still have a little under $4 million mortgage. So I guess, we've sort of been holding steady, and most of our tenants haven't asked about breaking the lease. We have done some special accommodations, rent deferral, some additional discounts for those that sublease more. A lot of their subtenants moved out. So there have been some special accommodations. I think I'm just worried about the long-term effects and what the future is. No one has asked to break their lease yet, but we've got 3 or 4 coming at the end of this year. And I'm hesitant to go into leasing negotiations until they're able to return in some capacity to their spaces. So, trying to ensure we have appropriate reserves to meet any vacancies. But I was reassured, I guess, to see that people are still interested in sharing space, because we do have certain spaces that, there's some more flexible workspace for, but I wasn't really surprised that arts and culture and education sectors were the most impacted. Certainly we have been, and of the tenants that we have, those have been the most impacted as well. Amazing findings. Thank you for sharing it. It's something I'll share with our board as well.
Thank you. Others? There's a question in the chat, actually, and Saul, I'm wondering if you might have some insight into this. So Francis from Walter and Lee's Haas Fund said, I observed that only 9% of those surveyed owned their spaces. So I had a large enough group to tell if people are falling behind on mortgage payments at a similar rate to those falling behind on rent. It is a pretty small percentage. I'd say it's probably hard to know from that, but Saul, do you have any other kind of insight into folks around mortgage payments? Yeah.
No, I mean, that's interesting because like we talked about this as we were doing the analysis and whether or not we could say anything there. And it is too small of a sample to really tease anything out. But I would say like generally that like Community Vision has not heard sort of a drumbeat from, the nonprofits that we work with or who own space around those concerns. So but that doesn't mean it's not happening and a real thing out there, but that has not been something that either Community Vision's consulting practice or its lending practice has really heard from our borrowers or our clients. So, I mean, at least that's good news for now. I think, again, we don't know what's going to come next as city funding dries up for organizations and how much PPP has been able to stave off sort of crisis for organizations around their operations and things like mortgage payments. So I think, the next couple of quarters we may start to see, sort of new cracks in sustainability for organizations. And then particularly depending on what happens for, the city and county of San Francisco and the city of Oakland and their funding of organizations and their work. So we're at the front end of what particularly the direct service, human service organizations that rely on local government will be facing.
Yeah, I think with the PPP and in 2020, a lot of organizations got, maybe additional money from their funders. There were certain levels of support, I think, that folks were able to rely on that might not be there going forward. Yeah, and I think too that just that quote that you lifted up, Haley, around, we've been making it work for this long, but don't know how much longer we can do it, is tough. I think something else that just kind of from the report that sort of, I don't know, it sparked these thoughts for me that, there's so many organizations who are paying their full, rent at a time when they also had all sorts of other unplanned for expenses that they had to accommodate for, to bring services online and, I don't know, maybe get people equipment so they could work from home, all sorts of things that they're, nonprofits make it work because they're mission driven and they have to, but at what cost? So, and how long is that sustainable for? So, this is one of my observations. And also I think another thing that kind of stuck out for me, and I'd be, again, to our multi-tenant center folks on the call, I think these questions around what does Workspace look like moving forward and what are folks thinking about, particularly with shared space and shared service. And, there's I just saw like an article, I think in the Chronicle this morning about how much, vacant available space there is, like 11 Salesforce towers in San Francisco. And I don't know what work is going to look like moving forward. So, and it's, it kind of seems like there's more, folks might be looking for just a different type of space and more flex space. So wondering, maybe Lexi or anybody else, if there are things that you're thinking about how you might change as a nonprofit center to accommodate that.
Sure. Hi, everybody. This is Lexi Plaza. I'm Deputy Director of Real Estate and Operations at Tides. So just to sort of echo Lori's sentiments, so over the last 12 months, we've provided flexibility to tenants that have requested it and we have lost a handful of tenants as well, most of whom had their programming inextricably linked to education. So when the schools closed, they couldn't continue programming. So their programming either stopped entirely or at least was drastically reduced. And so they no longer needed or could afford space. We have a plan to survey our tenants this month, actually, to figure out exactly what they're thinking in terms of return to work now that San Francisco is finally entering a less restrictive tier in terms of non-essential office operations. Now we're interested to see, as reopening is finally sort of a glimmer of hope, what our 80 tenants are expecting in terms of use of space. I'm sort of two minds. I could see that shared space could be turned into private demised offices, because people are now, if they are going to be in the office, they want to do the kind of work that they can't get done at home, which means that they want quiet heads down time. And then also I see, lots of chatter around the new way of work is going to be the office as a center for culture and socialization. And so private demised offices could be turned back into shared space that's wired for virtual connection, but ultimately prioritizes the human experience of the things you can't get at home, like socializing with your colleagues. So I'm stuck in the middle of the tension between those two things. Our plan for Tides Converge San Francisco and Tides Converge New York is to stay the course with our existing shared space, ensure that it's all connected via Zoom room, so that anytime folks are using a meeting space, they can connect really seamlessly with any of their distributed workforce or remote teams. And ensure that our shared space is flexible and feels good, so that folks can start to re-socialize themselves as we all come back from the last year of isolation.
Thanks, Lexi. So other folks, what questions do you have? Are there barriers for the nonprofits on the call? Does this reflect your experience? Are there what are some of the barriers you're facing as you think about safely reopening? Love to hear from some more folks.
Hi, Sarah. I'm happy to chime in on the Sarado Center for Nonprofits. Hi, everybody. This is Remy Ann, property manager and transitioning into program director for our nonprofit centers. Just a couple of updates for our properties. We have, waived CAM and rent for now just about a year. We've been in a very fortunate position to be able to do that for our nonprofit tenants, which in speaking with all of them, they've been very appreciative because of just the financial implications of funding and development due to COVID, and, not being able to do all of the things that they had planned for the developmental aspect of the last year. In terms of what we're looking forward to, very similar in terms of we plan to survey our tenants as well, to just hear back from them. What are their plans? When do you plan to return? Even as we are moving into a different tier, that doesn't necessarily mean folks are going to be ready, and ready to go through the doors right away. So it looks as though we'll probably have a phased approach and really see, based on safety and comfort of not just the nonprofit partners, but also our own team and on-site staff, what that looks like. And in terms of shared space, kind of in the same boat as everyone here, right? Really going to see what folks are saying, what the needs are. We know it's going to change. But I know intentionally with us, we've put a pause on leasing out additional spaces, just due to the pandemic and due to capacity as well on our own side, but also trying to see it as a potential opportunistic silver lining of the pandemic. We have some potential spaces, and what does that mean? Maybe it's more of the shared space of the drop-ins or the private offices, or the hybrid, model. It's really sort of TBD based on, what the community needs are and what organizations say. So just a little update on us.
Thank you. It'd be great, if you're able to share with the Nonprofit Displacement Project the results of the surveys that you're doing, and Lexi, same with you. If there's some level of info that could be shared back, I'd love to kind of see what's coming out of that. Other questions or responses? Oh, thanks, Lori. You can share yours too. Okay. There's a question in the chat. Just curious if you're seeing larger trends regionally that will result in a net loss of spaces for the arts and other space-based nonprofit organizations. In Berkeley in 2020, Berkeley startups raised more than 700 million through venture, angel-backed financing, and convertible securities. Yeah, the loss of, so one of the things, and Saul, you might want to jump in here too. Saul, you could probably talk to larger trends, but I know one of the concerns that we've had both on the commercial real estate side as well as on the housing side is just the amount of money being amassed on the private side to buy up distressed properties. And one of the goals of the Nonprofit Displacement Project is really around permanently preserving affordable space for nonprofits and solutions that that are able to lock in space permanently. So helping organizations to purchase space, or multi-tenant nonprofit tenant centers that have permanent affordability are solutions that we really see as being essential for long term. Because with I know at least like with some of the opportunities that I think are out there right now around corporate space that's vacant, and lots of the large tech companies are going to be going fully remote, and what type of office space that opens up, that there could be a potential for some sort of partnership with the corporate and tech sector around leasing space, but there's no permanence to that affordability. That's kind of up to the whims of those organizations around how long they would have favorable rates. So, it can be kind of a stopgap solution, but really owning is a permanent solution, and that is best. Saul, do you want to say anything else about this, maybe about trends?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as we went into the pandemic, we were definitely very concerned that we would, drawing on the experience of 2008, that, that we might see the same kind of distress in assets, and more, as Sarah kind of pointed out, like that there might be, that global capital got ready, right? They amassed tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars to go buy stuff. So far, that hasn't played out the way that we thought it might. I think what's happening now that's really interesting is there's a lot of concern about what's going to happen in commercial corridors and retail spaces. And for instance, tomorrow, the Federal Reserve's hosting a small group meeting around the retail spaces in affordable housing properties, or spaces owned and run by community development corporations. I think we've been hearing others talk about other kinds of neighborhood corridors and what's going to happen with those retail spaces. So I think there may be the thing that we were worried about before may come up, coupled with the transfer of wealth that we're seeing from intergenerational wealth from boomers who are like trying to figure out what to do with their asset, and now the asset's distressed because there's no tenant in it. And so we're kind of watching that, and as possibly maybe a silver lining for the sector for nonprofits to be able to control community space, and certainly interest in community ownership of community assets. I think, this question around, as Haley pointed out, like this is a different experience for arts and culture organizations as it is for direct service and human service organizations. And I think the big thing that we'll need the big response that we're going to need is to be able to get arts and culture organizations capital for reopening. So if they lost a space that they made a tenant improvement in that was specialized, like that's not generally very cheap, right? Especially, I mean, the loss of a black box theater, the loss of other kinds of specialized arts and culture space, we're just going to have to figure out where the capital is going to come from to be able to invest in new spaces if those organizations have gone into hibernation. Ideally, we would move into things that look like the stuff that Remy Ann, Lexi, and Lori run, right? So that we can move into permanent homes with landlords who have long views about their tenancy and won't displace nonprofit tenants when we get hit vulnerable times. There could be other strategies with community-based owners like CLTs and CDCs, but I think as we go into reopening, there's definitely going to be a capital need for arts and culture to be able to take back space. And then if they're working with community vision, we'll be looking really hard at what are the safeguards that we can put around that capital investment in tenant improve the specialized tenant improvements. But it's definitely like a concern around how do we bring arts and culture back to communities.
Thanks, all. Other questions? So sorry, it's going to be loud here for a second in my house because my family is walking in the door. Wondering, okay, sorry. So for nonprofits, we'd love to also just hear what types of assistance that you're looking for. I mean, I know in the report we sort of lifted out, Haley had lifted out the like what's next, and many organizations just broadly looking for financial assistance, and then also different types of TA and assistance around reopening. Would love to hear if there's anything, if there are other things, or which of those really resonate with you. This is a time that can really help kind of give guidance to the Nonprofit Displacement Project working group. So would love to hear some things about that, or for funders, if there are particular things that your grantees are really asking you about for assistance, would love to hear that as well.
I would just echo something that I actually saw on the report, the need for pro bono, not just legal help. So I'm the executive director of the Brower Center, and since I did unfortunately have to lay off a fair amount of our staff due to our shuttered operations, I am now all property management, all grant making, all facility. So there's a lot of things that, like with reopening especially, there's so much information out there, just even for our own HR practices, that it feels a little overwhelming, like who to listen to. And so having someone, from all those sectors, like HR, certainly facility, like chief building engineer, definitely real estate legal advice, because I have, tenants certainly that are asking, like, we are interested in coming back, what do we do? And it's you're having to be an expert in all things, and relying on CDC guidelines is great, and city and health directives, but there are some questions that are kind of, especially when it comes to HR, and like, can you ask staff to be vaccinated, and all of the sort of legal complications within also putting together a protection plan. And so having access to sort of experts in different areas, I think would be helpful.
Thanks, Lori. I'm going to see if maybe one last question, and then I'll have a little poll for you guys. All right, well, I'm going to launch the poll then. So we just have a quick poll. Again, NCG, we have our Nonprofit Displacement Project. So really wanting to hear from you, what do you think the top action is that NCG, through our Nonprofit Displacement Project, along with Community Vision, should be taking to help nonprofits in this moment? So just take a second to share your answer to this. We're going to close the poll in about a few more seconds. All right, I think you can share the results now. Okay, shared space solutions, excellent. Yeah, I think there's a lot to figure out about the reopening, which, I think, as we're kind of moving into this, and as people mentioned, counties are moving into less restrictive tiers. And so particularly around the reopening, I know Saul and I have from Community Vision that we have a lot of questions around this and what folks are thinking about. One of the things that we're planning to do next is to do some focus groups with some of the respondents from the surveys, from the report. And we want to do these in the next few months to really kind of dig in a bit deeper, particularly around these reopening questions, and see how that can kind of help inform our thinking for where we go next. I did also just want to offer to funders that are on the call who are not currently participating in the Nonprofit Displacement Project working group. If you're interested in learning more about what that group is and kind of what we do beyond what I shared today, I just dropped a link in there that takes you to the page that's got more info on the reports, but also just please reach out to me if you're curious to talk a little bit more about this group and see if you're interested in getting involved. So those are our plans for our next step. And I just want to give a big thanks to Haley and Harder+Company for being really great partners with us on this project. Thank you, Saul, and Community Vision for all the work that you also did to help get this survey together and report out, and for your partnership on the Nonprofit Displacement Project working group. If folks, as you're kind of looking through the report, if you have other questions about the data behind it, please feel free to reach out to me. We have, like all the data books from behind the report, and can, maybe kind of look into certain questions a little bit more if they come up for you. That's definitely been something that's been helpful in the past reports that we've done, where, maybe cities or a particular foundation wants a little bit more specific data about something, we've been able to share that. So really happy to do that and partner in any way that's helpful. So, if you have other questions or other ideas, anything nonprofit displacement related and reopening related, please think of me as a partner. Really happy to work with folks on this. And with that, I think we're good. So thank you everybody for joining us.